Hello, everyone. My name is Ann Kokis, and I am the director of the UVA East Asia Center. Today, we are very fortunate to welcome Michael Berry, professor of contemporary Chinese cultural studies and director of the UCLA Center for Chinese Studies, as the first speaker in our fall speaker series. Professor Berry's areas of research include modern and contemporary Chinese literature, Chinese cinema, popular culture in modern China, and literary translation. His approach is transnational, and his work addresses the richness and diversity of Chinese art and culture as it has manifested itself in mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other Sinophone communities. His forthcoming book, Translation, Disinformation, and Wuhan Diary, Anatomy of a Transpacific Cyber Campaign, traces an online controversy surrounding Fang Fang's account of the novel coronavirus outbreak and the first citywide lockdown in Wuhan in 2020. Notably, and I would encourage all of you to pre-order his book, which is available now from Amazon. And I'd also like to take a special moment to thank Professor Berry for being here. He's a leading scholar in Chinese media and Chinese film, and I found him to be an incredible personal inspiration when I was starting in my career. So it's really remarkable and very special for me to be able to host him here at UVA as he's launching this new book. So thank you so much, Professor Berry, and we're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and it's also wonderful to see all your accomplishments that you've gone on to achieve since leaving UCLA, and it's just great we've maintained our in touch, and I really look forward to sharing this work with you and the members of the University of Virginia community. So if you bear with me one moment, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so thanks again. And the talk today, COVID-19 text power, Fang Fang and the birth of the Wuhan Diary genre, is a kind of strange talk in a sense, because it's not your typical academic analytic presentation. It actually has a very strong autobiographical story that's tied into this. And that goes back to 2020 when COVID was just beginning. And if you remember, the first citywide lockdown was in Wuhan, China. And at that time, there was a writer named Fang Fang who started to write an online blog. She wrote this blog for 60 days. The initial lockdown lasted 76 days, so it spanned most of that entire lockdown period. And the blog went viral, and it started to attract an incredible number of readers, of supporters, of haters. At one point, she was getting probably hundreds of millions of hits online per entry. That just speaks to the kind of popularity of this blog and the role that it had in informing people about what was happening during the early days of the lockdown. It was a strange blog because it contained, on the one hand, very personal accounts of how she was doing, how her pet dog was doing, how she was getting dog food amid all of the shutdowns, to medical information that she was getting from a series of doctor friends. She had 4 doctor friends that she was in regular contact with, and they would pass on basic medical knowledge and information about COVID-19. They would update her with the latest things happening at the various hospitals in the city in terms of number of beds, availability of patients to be admitted. And then there were also incredibly brave passages where she said things in that diary that people just don't say in mainstream media in China. For instance, she directly addressed the internet censors and said, "Let us speak. We're all quarantined, we're locked down, we're frustrated, we're scared. The least you can do is let us speak our mind and let our emotions be articulated via these different platforms." There were calls of accountability when there were missteps early on in the handling of COVID-19. She called government officials to task to apologize, to make wrongs right in terms of how they were handling certain things. She also gave various suggestions. For instance, the suggestion of busing patients suffering from other ailments, non-COVID ailments, out of the city to other neighboring provinces where they could receive medical treatment, because of course one of the great crises then and even more recently in China during the Shanghai lockdown and other citywide lockdowns is chronically ill patients who are unable to receive medical aid for non-COVID ailments because of the lockdowns and because hospitals, all of their resources are devoted to COVID. So these are some of the things that she was talking about. And she had an incredible army of supporters. However, when news of this diary, when news broke that the diary was going to be translated into Western languages, when that came out on the internet around April 8th of 2020, all of a sudden, almost overnight, the tide changed and the discourse changed. And a writer who had been heralded as the voice of Wuhan, the conscience of China, was suddenly vilified and all of a sudden became target to countless troll attacks, death threats, and just a deluge of online violence was unleashed. I was in the middle of this because I was the translator of the English edition of Wuhan Diary, which you see an image there. And today the talk that I'm giving is very much, and partly in celebration of the paperback release of Wuhan Diary, which just came out last week, which you see on the right. And on the left is a book called Translation, Disinformation, and Wuhan Diary, Anatomy of a Transpacific Cyber Campaign, which is something I wrote starting around June of 2020 to document what was taking place before my eyes. Because as this online hate campaign became unleashed, I very quickly started to see so much of the discourse around Wuhan Diary was also being erased, and so many pro-Fang Fang voices, so much of the truth was just being obscured by this shadow of disinformation. And it felt just like Fang Fang had kind of taken up the role to bear witness to what was happening. At some point, she lost her voice, and I'll talk about how that happened. And it became important for me to, at the least, one thing I could do was document what was happening and try to bear witness to the injustices that she was subjected to amid this incredible moment in history. And so what I'm going to do today is structure my talk along a series of questions about how a diary, an online diary, became the subject to basically a nationwide political debate and a nationwide hate campaign like it did. And eventually I'm going to talk about how the diary itself spawned an entire genre of Wuhan diaries, alternative Wuhan diaries, and what those look like and how that evolved. So how did this nationwide debate begin? Part of it were you had to have several preconditions in place for what happened to transpire. And the first was this massive readership. Like I said, Fang Fang had tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of readers engaged with her diary. In the beginning of the lockdown, there were multiple media sources all covering what was happening in Wuhan. There were non-official media sources, of course, CCTV, Xinhua News, all the major public government outlets were covering what was happening. But somehow this retired writer living alone in her apartment, her voice cut through all the noise and became the voice that people gravitated towards. And I think a lot of that has to do with the authenticity of that voice, that she wasn't pandering to anybody. She was telling it like it is. When she saw positive things that were happening, she documented them. And when she saw negative things, she criticized them. And I think that won a lot of people's hearts, that they felt this is a voice they can trust. And so this readership built, and it became the kind of go-to place for people to get the raw, on-the-ground account of what was happening in Wuhan. Part of that authenticity, I think, also comes from its explosive nature, that this was not like Fang Fang's other work that is a highly manicured and edited and aesthetic piece of written word that was, produced over the course of many months or many years. This was something that was produced every day. She would document what was happening, and she would usually upload these accounts sometime between midnight and 2 or 3 a.m. And when she did, these weren't edited. Sometimes there were mistakes. Sometimes there was information she got wrong, which she later corrected. But there was a passion, there was a rawness, there was an explosiveness to this account. And I think that that's also something that really drew people in. It was a deep dive into the experience of what it was like to be under lockdown. And it was an experience unlike now that all of us have at that point. It was a way to vicariously understand what so many citizens in Wuhan were going through. When you combine that massive readership with her repeated calls for accountability, this is one of the major themes in the diary, are these calls for accountability for officials who had screwed up, who had dropped the ball, who had led to more deaths, to more harm, for them to stand up, apologize, and resign. And she repeatedly says that in the diary. And those calls get stronger and stronger as the diary continues. And I think this is probably one of the more dangerous aspects of the diary in terms of why this disinformation campaign was born, was I think that these calls for accountability were very, very dangerous for the ruling party in terms of the potential for escalation, the potential for destabilization. Because if her army of readers, millions of readers, start to take up those same same lines, calling the government to a higher level of accountability, that could really have some destabilizing effects. Excuse me. It's also important to understand that these attacks didn't come out of nowhere. If you go back in time all the way to 2017, Fang Fang had actually been under attack for an earlier book. It was actually a novel entitled Soft Burial. Soft Burial was a work of historical fiction that examined the land reform campaign during the early post-liberation period, post-1949 period, and the many decades of post-traumatic after effect that it had on a family that had been victimized during the land reform campaign. That book, although published in China and it won a major award, started to become a target of various ultra-leftist groups in China, who not only launched an attack and held conferences to condemn the book, very much like the Cultural Revolution, these kind of 批判大会, these criticism meetings or denunciation meetings against the book. The pressure that they exerted actually resulted in Soft Burial being banned a year after its publication in 2017. That's important because the group that comes after Wuhan Diary 3 years later is the same group that had gone after Soft Burial in 2017. The earliest attacks are from the same group of people. And so you can directly tie it to that. And eventually this leads to an unprecedented level of cyber attacks against Fang Fang that are carried out on a number of different levels. So what are the attacks focused on? It's a variety of different perspectives that are revealed through these attacks. On the one hand, they accuse Fang Fang of waging hearsay, of spreading hearsay and spreading secondhand accounts. This is largely due to the fact that she's not a frontline worker. She's not in a hospital. She's not out there on the street. She's in her apartment. She's getting most of the information from social media, over the telephone, text messages from friends and other doctors that she's close with. And she usually does not reveal their identity. And she's very self-conscious about that. And so she'll often, in the diary, refer to them as my doctor friend, my neighbor, my colleague, but she very rarely will give their actual personal name. And she does that precisely because she had been targeted by these ultra-leftist groups for many years, and especially after the diary started to go viral, the attacks started to increase in number, and she wanted to protect these individuals. She knew that they too would be targeted, which is why she conceals their names. So it's done for a very practical reason. But later on, when the trolls are looking for ways to condemn her and undermine her, and what they go after is this notion of truth, because so many people gravitated to the diary because of the authenticity that it represented. That's precisely what is targeted. And so they start to claim that everything she's saying is lies. They actually refer to it as the book of lies. And all of these accounts by friends are actually hearsay, secondhand accounts, and they are not to be trusted. So they go after this notion of authenticity, and then they start to, from there, launch into conspiracy theories. And these take on a myriad of forms to from the fact that, from the allegation that COVID-19 was planted by the United States and that this whole diary is a US conspiracy. There are allegations that I wasn't the translator, but in fact, I was the writer and she was the puppet that was out there just pretending to be the author of the diary. Others claim that I was a CIA agent working with a team of translators around the clock to produce this piece of quote unquote evidence, which would then be used to hurt China. It would be one of the most popular conspiracy theories was the 地道者论, the passing the knife theory, that Fang Fang had passed the knife to the Americans, including myself, and that knife was now being sharpened and would be used by the United States government and Donald Trump's regime to hurt China, to hurt the reputation, to exact reparations against China, and that this was a piece of manufactured evidence. There were conspiracy theories about the virus origins, which Fang Fang never discusses. Not once in the diary does she talk about where the scientific origin of the virus came from. And they talk about all these political motivations, mostly that this was a US government funded operation. Allegations that I received millions of dollars in compensation for being a part of this operation. So they get pretty wacky. So eventually they go into the land of, there are allegations that the Freemason Society in the United States was behind the diary, and they just get stranger and stranger. And then, of course, there are what we normally think of when we think of online hate and online violence are personal attacks. And these included hate mail, death threats, also investigations into Fang Fang's finances, her property holdings, her so-called elitist entitlement. And I think a lot of this was aimed to appeal to some of the Weibo users and Chinese social media users with lower maybe income standards and maybe perhaps lower educational levels, who would be swayed by the fact that this was an elitist who was taking advantage of the suffering of the people of Wuhan to gain fame, to gain notoriety, and to gain money. And these are the type of attacks that we saw quite often during the Cultural Revolution, basically attacking her so-called privileged background. And so this was another way in which some of this played out. They were waged on a multiple number of fronts, and it was quite sophisticated. This was not a simple case of online trolls posting hate mail. You did have that, and that was a major part of the attack, was the social media attacks and the death threats. The death threats, of course, are particularly disturbing in that they have the ability to silence individuals, because once your very life is at stake, or there's the sense that that might be the case, people tend to shut up or take a more conservative approach. And I think a lot of these threats were aimed at shutting it down, shutting her down, shutting me down. I, of course, also became the target of many of these attacks and death threats starting in April of 2020. But what I experienced was the tip of the iceberg compared to what Fang Fang was subjected to. For her, this became really one of the most protracted attacks against a writer in modern China, period, in decades. And that's probably since the Cultural Revolution had we seen a single writer targeted like this for such an extended period of time. More than 2 years, she was receiving these daily attacks, daily death threats. And even today, we're coming up more than 2.5 years later, this is still ongoing. And then there was this disinformation campaign. So it wasn't just online chatter, but often official government mouthpieces like the Global Times and other more legitimate websites would also pick up on some of the conspiratorial ramblings that were taking place on social media and amplify them in quote unquote official stories. Simultaneous to that, they would target pro-Fang Fang posts or individuals that were trying to correct the disinformation, and that would be labeled fake news. And often it would be cleansed from the internet or censored. One Concrete case in point I can give you is at one point in 2020, I did an interview with Radio France International in Chinese about the incident where I was precisely trying to address the trolls and the disinformation and correct a lot of the lies that had been circulating. I posted this interview on my personal Weibo page in the middle of this. It got, I think, 340,000 reads in 2 hours, and then it was taken down. And then the trolls went through the interview and pulled out quotes that would be taken out of context and then used to give more legitimacy to their own conspiratorial readings of what was happening. And so that's kind of how it works, and became a vicious cycle whereby even when you tried to speak truth to the lies, you would be silenced, and then components of that discourse would be used in the benefit of the troll discourse. So you have this silencing of individuals that are defending Fang Fang, a kind of witch hunt of sorts, where they're not just silenced, but in some cases, they're actually subjected to actual persecution. One example is Professor Liang Yanping, who was actually called up to be officially investigated by her university after the trolls attacked her. She was removed from all teaching duties. She was expelled from the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, that's a pretty serious repercussion for someone who has spent their life, working at the university. And there were many other intellectuals like Wang Xiaoni who are also targeted and subjected to official investigations by their universities in China at the behest of these trolls. There was also pressure to suppress publication of Wuhan Diary. Of course, in China, it was originally under contract by multiple publishers, both one in Hong Kong and one in mainland China, and all of those contracts were canceled. And internationally, there was also pressure on some of the foreign publishers to cease publication. Thankfully, they all proceeded. But there was definitely a major thrust to shut this entire book project down. There was the employment of popular culture to discredit Fang Fang, and this came in a variety of guises, from pop music to political artwork, and I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. And finally, an inundation of parallel political official narratives. So as Fang Fang's myth, so to speak, this kind of larger than life guise that she had assumed during the early days of the lockdown was systematically, piece by piece, attacked, broken down, and dismantled, a new series of official narratives rises up to take its place. So I'm just going to show you a few images of what some of that looked like. I know I gave you a lot of different aspects of how this disinformation campaign was manifested. So these are just a few images. This one is from my personal Weibo page message board from April 8th. This is just a couple of screenshots, 2 screenshots of the type of messaging that was directed to me at the height of this. And here you probably have maybe, I don't know, 3 dozen messages, but this is representative of a body of thousands, probably tens of thousands of messages like this that I received, which go for everything from profanities to racist language to all-out death threats. Your son will die in 3 days. Your family will live in hell forever and never get peace. I mean, these are the kind of things that that I was dealing with. But again, I want to emphasize, it's nothing compared to what Fang Fang was getting on a daily basis. There was also the rise of a series of anti-Fang Fang publications. And these are book-length publications, often published as ebooks online, that appeared overnight. This is in mid-April to early June of 2020. So the first of these publications appeared while Fang Fang's diary was actually still being written. And a group of scholars, likely a collective of scholars, culled together all of these conspiratorial theories and thoughts and tried to wrap them up in an academic guise and publish these monographs. And so one of them, you have 2 versions of Great Wuhan but Bad Diary by Fan Ren, which is clearly a pen name for an individual or a group of individuals. And on the right is actually by a researcher from Wuhan University named Feng Tran, who wrote a criticism of Fang Fang's diary. And so These are just a few examples of that. So academia was kind of called up to join the cause. There was also there's a professor at Peking University named Zhang Yiwu, a literature professor, who also took up the cause and posted more than 100 extended discourse posts about Fang Fang's diary over the course of 2020 and 2021. The word count of those, if you put them together, far exceeds the diary itself. And so you also have that type of activity that's taking place. On Chinese social media, there's the proliferation of this cultural revolution-esque imagery in the form of posters and revolutionary slogans. This one, 打倒帝国主义走狗，卖国贼，Fang Fang. So bring down the imperialist running dog and traitor to China, Fang Fang. And there she is in the guise of a dog with a wagging tail, writing her diary while being attacked by this kind of, I think we can imagine these to be the new generation of Red Guards, the little pinks who are kind of sophisticated with their red lantern and the red flags behind them and backed up by ideology. So instead of the workers, peasants, and soldiers, it's this new generation of ideologically awakened youth that are attacking Fang Fang. But it's not just online. These are, what you see here are actual posters posted just blocks away from Fang Fang's home in Wuhan. And these are Cultural Revolution era style, big character denunciation posters. These are kind of not big, but little posters. But if you read these, and I translated a couple excerpts here, they're very much in the same format as the Cultural Revolution era big character posters. There was a format which has been discussed by other scholars of how those big character posters were written. Usually you induce the name of Chairman Mao and the country and the party, the guy who give you authority, you name someone, you name their crimes, then you call upon justice to be enacted. You call upon a certain punishment to be done. And then you see that very clearly in these posters, that these are written in that same format, where they're calling upon both verbal and physical attacks against Fang Fang. They're calling a crusade of justice against her for what she has done and the terrible crime she has committed. And instead of Chairman Mao, they call upon New China, the red flag. And so there's still that kind of nationalist imagery that is imbuing them with the legitimacy to make these calls. So you have these posters. You've even had people throwing bricks into towards Fang Fang's compound over the fence or the wall into her compound. This is on WeChat. This is a WeChat user or group that's called 红四小兵, the Little Red Soldiers. And this was something that was circulated in April. And it's 下一个会是谁呢？那就继续看方方的朋友圈吧. So, who will be next? Keep an eye on Fang Fang's circle of friends and you will find out. And what does that mean? Who will be next? It's very clear. This is part of the witch hunt. If you are friends with Fang Fang, if you are associated with her, in particular, if you are supporting her and articulating your support, you will be targeted, you will be singled out, and you too will be subject to online violence. And maybe the online violence often leads to real world consequences like investigations, because what happens is the trolls will not only attack the individual, but they will go after their employer or their university and give those organizations pressure. Why aren't you doing anything? Why aren't you doing anything? Haven't you seen the crimes this person has committed? And then, so in one case at UVA University, the dean didn't want to be targeted. And after this, trolls started coming after the dean saying, why aren't you investigating Lian Anping? The dean finally did launch an investigation, and they also went public, and because they needed to kind of make that there would be a press release. We have formally launched an investigation against Professor so-and-so in order to make good with the trolls. And you see very clearly the way this troll discourse is leading so much of these decisions that are made by major universities in China, major cultural organizations. This also creeped into popular music. So this was one of the stranger kind of pages of the Fang Fang incident that I think even I was unprepared for. And that is also around April of 2020, there was a whole series of pop songs that started to appear on streaming sites like Bilibili and also on YouTube internationally. that were releasing professionally produced, highly polished pop songs with anti-Fang Fang lyrics. And in some cases, they would take existing pop songs, like in this case, Jay-Z and Alicia Keys' hit song, Empire State of Mind, which was remixed with new Chinese lyrics that were anti-Fang Fang lyrics. So you can even see in the subtitles there under Jay-Z is, it said there's an old lady, her name is Fang Fang, and then it goes on to list all of her crimes. There were also original songs. There was an artist named Bo Peep who wrote a song called Square on the Outside, Round on the Inside, I believe. And again, it's kind of a greatest hits of all of the conspiracy theories that were waged against Fang Fang. Anti-Fang Fang political art. This is by Wu Heqiling, an artist that is referred to now as the Wolf Warrior artist. And he also went viral during the COVID period in early 2020 for this and a series of other works of digital art, highly nationalistic. There was one about George Floyd, there's several about Donald Trump, and this one is about Fang Fang, and it's called Crowned Jester. And here we see Fang Fang groveling on the ground like a clown, holding this book. And if you probably can't read it, but it says the Book of Lies, and it's bloody and has a knife in it. That's the famous passing the knife, die Daozi. And here she's literally passing the knife to an American general who is crowning her, not with a crown, but with a dog collar. And meanwhile, the American and international media is eating this up in the background, taking photos, making her a celebrity. And so it's kind of a greatest hits of all of the conspiratorial theories that had been circulating online. And this really kind of crystallized of that for a lot of readers and a lot of internet users. One thing that's important to realize over the course of this, of course, the pro-Fang Fang discourse, all of those millions of followers that had adored her and stood by her side, all of that starts to change because this is all that's left, this incredible deluge of negativity, of criticism, of lies, conspiratorial thought, and everything else is left behind. And so eventually public opinion on Fang Fang indeed does start to sway. And this woman who had been heralded for her bravery, for her courage, for her ability to speak truth to power in one of the darkest times in recent Chinese historical and cultural memory, all of a sudden gets twisted overnight into this enemy of the people. And most people believe it. This is another image, kind of Boxer Rebellion era style, or late Qing imagery of burning the book, the Fang Fang Diary. And you notice all of these images refer to it not as Wuhan Diary, but as Fang Fang Ruji, Fang Fang's diary. And that's also a very clear ideological decision on the part of the trolls. And why? Well, the book was attacked for many things, but one of them was that Fang Fang did not have the right to speak for Wuhan. She was not the voice of Wuhan. She was not, this is not kind of the be all end all account of what the Wuhan lockdown. It's a personal account and it should only be looked upon as such. And so the trolls never call it Wuhan Diary. They always refer to it as Fang Fang Diary. And that and there's of the many attacks against the book, one of them was there was a whole line of attacks against the title of the book. And that's something we can talk about if you're interested later on. But in my account, I actually have a whole chapter just on the attacks aimed at the title to show how much was projected onto the title of the book. More political art, I can break this down later in the Q&A if anyone is interested, but it's just to give you a sense of the way in which this book was presented online during the height of these attacks. This is a word cloud image that is produced by a Hong Kong University-based WeChat Scope organization, which basically traces censorship online, particularly on the platform of WeChat. And if you look at the bottom of this image in Chinese, you see Fang Fang. I think hopefully you can see my cursor highlighting it here. So the size of the font shows you the level of censorship during this period from February through October of 2020. So you can see that Fang Fang was one of the more censored terms in China online during this time. And that just speaks to how how much length was gone to curate the discourse surrounding Fang Fang, surrounding Wuhan Diary. This kind of conspiratorial theory would not disappear after the Wuhan lockdown. It would continue, as I mentioned, this lasts more than 2 years. This is from a post from more than a year and a half later. And I just brought you this to show just how wild and strange the conspiracy theories go. This one actually is talking about the American Congress taking steps to censure Fang Fang and actually call her to be held to account for being responsible for the American COVID-19 crisis and all of the deaths in America. And basically the argument in this and many other posts like it is that all these Americans went out and read the English version of Wuhan Diary, and they were misled to believe that COVID-19 was a human error on the part of the Chinese government. And so they didn't have to take any precautions because it wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't a disease, that it was completely the fault of the CCP, according to Fang Fang. Of course, Fang Fang never says this. But this was the kind of ridiculous argument that was being put forward, and that now Congress was calling Fang Fang to be extradited to the United States to stand trial for her crimes against the American people. This is just how crazy some of this goes. So I want to step back and now and really ask, what was at stake and why were such lengths taken to curate the discourse in such a way to spread all of this? And I think, and why would a writer who's writing basically a very personal but also public account of what was happening in these dark days during the Wuhan lockdown, why would it be the center of such incredible attention and debate? And I think what was at stake on the one hand is who gets to control the narrative about the outbreak in Wuhan and the COVID-19 outbreak in general. Clearly, the government had great stakes in controlling it according to the talking points that they wanted to put forward. I think Fang Fang's account in some ways matched with that, but in many cases it deviated. And those deviations were deemed to be completely unacceptable. And the lengths to which this one-sided account of what became a battle against COVID-19, that's how the government started to phrase it, was the kind of battle against the virus. And Fang Fang completely rejects those kind of notions. In fact, when the Chinese government started to call on the citizens of Wuhan to celebrate the victory over the virus, Fang Fang wrote a very strong post where she claimed, there is no victory, there's only the end. What is victory? This isn't a war, this isn't a battle. Nobody comes out ahead here, nobody wins this. And then in a later post where the government called for the people of Wuhan to express gratitude to the Chinese government for their handling, she wrote an even more powerful account of how the very word gratitude had been sullied by the government's call for gratitude. And if you have time to read that passage, I think it's one of the most moving and powerful passages in the diary, her passage about gratitude. And so a lot of this is about controlling the narrative. It's about the aforementioned issue of accountability and the fear that calls for accountability being escalated could damage or lead to instability in China. There were also these three issues. I have an asterisk: the issue of international reparations, the origin of the virus, and US-China political tensions. I want to be crystal clear that Fang Fang's account has nothing to do with any of those 3 points. She never at any point in her diary addresses US-China relations, doesn't talk about the origin of the virus, and doesn't talk about international reparations. However, if you just read the troll accounts, if you read the disinformation accounts, you will be 100% convinced that this is a book that is intent on intervening in those 3 discourses. And it is intent on hurting China, on hurting China's image internationally, on helping Western powers exert reparations from China. And so these topics became just completely intertwined with the discourse around the book, even though it has nothing, they're completely manufactured, completely artificial. But this was also took on a life of its own. And as the diary was being written, keep in mind, the diary is written from late January for a period of 60 days. It's begun on January 25th of 2020. And this is exactly the period where Donald Trump, in his political discourse, starts to raise the temperature in terms of US-China political relations. This is where he starts referring to COVID-19 as the quote unquote Kung flu or the China virus or Chinese virus. He starts saying we're going to make them pay, and using language highly racist in many cases and highly inflammatory to many people in China. And it's against that context that these troll attacks are rising up. And I do not think you can unhitch those two from one another. The troll attacks are very much, these are internet users in China who in some cases are quarantined, in some cases they're jobless, they are frustrated, they are angry, they are looking for a scapegoat. And Fang Fang became the manufactured scapegoat. I became part of that. And it became also a way to, a method of distraction, because it's a lot better for people in power in China to have your citizens raging online against America than raging against the Chinese government. And so this was a way, and also keep in mind, as all of this is taking place, there's a political discourse in China where people like Zhao Lijian are claiming that COVID-19 was spread by the United States during the military games in December of 2019. And so this plays into a larger sphere of anti-American discourse that's festering online, and it helps distract people to make America the enemy instead of being more introspective and thinking about what could our government have done better during the early days of COVID-19 in Wuhan. Finally, and this is, I think, a topic that's often underestimated, and that's how this incident tapped into larger debates about civil society in China. Ever since the rise of Xi Jinping in 2012, there have been a shrinkage of the cultural sphere in China in terms of what's permissible discourse. And I think you have a subsection of the population increasingly frustrated in terms of the way in which the walls are closing in. They are not able to publish the kind of books they used to be published. They're not able to teach the kind of things in the classroom they used to teach. Political education has become enunciated and reinforced in a way that it hadn't been in decades. And this has led to a fracture. On the one part, there's a demographic in society that's very much nationalistic and very happy with these policies and is happy to see China going in this new direction, in many ways harkering back towards kind of the Mao era. And there's also a very robust group of people in China who want to continue the reform era policies, who want a more liberal, democratic, transparent vision for Chinese society. And what you have here is this diary, this book, becomes a lightning rod for those divisions in society. And there are many cases, I have personally spoken to people, children who told me they can't talk to their parents because of their disagreement about Wuhan Diary, that the children are more liberal and the parents are more conservative or vice versa. This became a flashpoint, and it became a kind of litmus test for where you stood politically, whether you thought stability and prosperity for the Chinese Communist Party at all means necessary by all costs is where you stand, or whether or not we want a more transparent society where a woman can publish a diary and a true account of what was happening. And so I think that the diary really served this larger function in terms of galvanizing and highlighting these deeper rifts that were already present in society during this time. Eventually, this leads to a complete bifurcation of the Wuhan Diary narrative, not just within China, but also globally. So in the West, it becomes translated into 20 languages. It's lauded by major media outlets around the world, from the New York Times, the New Yorker, NPR, the London Times, you can go on. And very positive reviews in terms of how it was received internationally. Whereas within China, official outlets like the Global Times use language like "fans disappointed as Wuhan Diary's overseas publication gives ammunition to antagonist forces." This, of course, is the passing the knife theory. academician Zhang Boli writes, some Chinese intellectuals hold distorted values as represented by Fang Fang, or Fang Fang and her followers have been criticized for weaponizing netizens' posts to create biased narratives. And so this starts to split. And you even see that if you go, even today, go to Amazon and look at Wuhan Diary's ratings, and the trolls actually hopped the pond, so to speak. And when the book was first announced, they started to give it one-star reviews to kind of break its legs. And all of the one-star reviews repeat the same talking points that the trolls do in China, book of lies, hearsay, etc. Meanwhile, you have all of these international editions that are appearing. You also have a series of kind of global Wuhan diaries that start to appear. These three were published in Taiwan by authors like Wu Jing and Liu Yu, which also present kind of more personal and in some cases more introspective narratives about what really happened in Wuhan. But within China, you have this new genre of diaries that rises up to take the place of the now disappeared or purged Wuhan Diary. And so one by one, and this was kind of miraculous to witness in real time, from the period of roughly May through June of 2020, dozens of these alternative Wuhan diaries start to appear. And the titles all include the word diary. Many of them include Wuhan or a variation of that. But here you have the 2020 Wuhan Diary, which is a picture book. You have Wuhan's diary of its battle against the virus. I mentioned the battle, these kind of war-like imagery and battlefield-like imagery would start to become employed to great degree in the various discourses about what happened during the lockdown in Wuhan. So here's the diary of the battle against the quote-unquote virus, another diary of the battle against the virus, the angels diary, the angels, of course, being frontline workers, doctors, nurses, the angels in white, as they're sometimes referred to. This one was actually made into also a major stage production. There are television miniseries along these lines that are made. On the right is another Wuhan Diary, battle against the virus. Dr. Jan's Wuhan Diary, my temporary hospital diary. They go on and on and on. You even start to get children book versions of the diary. Sanmao, the kind of is the Mickey Mouse of China, a quintessential figure who's been around since 1935. There's the Sanmao's diary of his battle against the virus. You have this Mao, this cat wearing a face mask, which is another, and it's called The Beautiful Cat's Diary. And so these go on and on and on. There's in the middle, you have this confidence from effectiveness of foreigners Wuhan Diary. This is a foreign student studying in Wuhan who published his diary. And it's not just an inundation of publications, but there's also kind of an escalation of how various tactics that are employed to emphasize the primacy of these narratives. For instance, in this version of the Battle for Wuhan, or the diary about the Battle for Wuhan, it actually includes this special QR code that are embedded into the book. And see, it's right there on the cover. And when you read the book, as you flip through the pages, there's QR codes, dozens and dozens of them throughout the book. And when you are reading, you take out your phone, you scan the code, and it will take you to videos, to stories, to testimonials, to give you a much more enhanced reading experience. And I would argue it's also on a kind of psychological level during the COVID period, one of the things that gave people a great sense of assuredness and safety was the scanning of the QR codes. When you go to a store, when you leave your apartment, so you know you're negative and you know the people around you are negative. So it's kind of a sense of biosafety, which is embedded into people's everyday lives, is now carried over into the reading experience, which I think also exacerbates the reader's sense that what they're reading is authentic. It's provable. It's authenticated not only by the pages on the book, but these additional testimonial videos, etc. And all of this is meant, the kind of unseen target of this is, of course, Fang Fang's account, which is suppressed amid all of this. And this is what's rising up to take its place. And in some cases, the discourse directly addresses that. So this is one of the alternative Wuhan diaries by An Yan. says Wuhan Girls, Anyan's Diary. And in some of the press to promote the book, it says, quote, "Is this another Wuhan Diary like Fang Fang's?" This is a question some Chinese netizens posed. And it goes on, however, compared to the controversy stirred by Wuhan Diary, which took a critical stance toward the lockdown, this book projects warmth, empathy, optimism, giving hope to many Chinese readers wrestling with the bitterness of life. This is the talking point. Fang Fang is negative. She is dark. She is critical. She is not at the front line. It's not authentic. But this is the real account, and this is going to give you the optimism, the hope, etc. This is another one from Diary of the Battle Against the Virus. This is the official editorial description. And it reads, and forgive me for this long passage, "This book reveals an accurate account of the Chinese people's resolve to conquer the novel coronavirus under the strong leadership of the Party Central Committee, with Comrade Xi Jinping at its core. The Wuhan frontline reporters," and I'm going to enunciate certain keywords here, "frontline reporters went straight to the scene where they dug deep and provided a complete account of what happened. Each report contained in this book is so real, vivid, heartwarming, and moving. The book conveys to the reader firm ideals and beliefs like, no matter what hardships we face, we shall rise up and overcome. We must face our challenges head on and push forward, work hard and do our best to control the outbreak and ensure that economic and social development can continue as planned so as to make a positive contribution to the building of a thoroughly prosperous society. This book is our way of paying our respects to the frontline medical workers, PLA soldiers, and other comrades who stood at the front lines of this battle against coronavirus. This book is also suitable as a study guide for party members, nationwide cadre students from elementary school through college and the broad masses." This reads almost like a direct, almost the bizarro version of Wuhan Diary, the way that it had been positioned. That it was criticized because Fang Fang was not a frontline worker. She was in her apartment. She was so-called spreading hearsay. She was critical. This is optimistic. This is inspirational. Hers was denounced, basically a poisonous weed to be uprooted. This is a study book that we can all use as a study guide from various levels. It's as if Fang Fang's account has not only been erased, but somehow the specter of it has directly shaped this opposite vision of discourse that took place within China. There are very little accounts of high-level officials commenting on Wuhan Diary. It was mostly lower-level kind of minions that were called upon to do the dirty work. But of great significance was this tweet by Zhao Lijian, the spokesperson for the Chinese government. And I mentioned earlier this account by a foreign student based in Wuhan, "Confidence Comes from Effectiveness, a foreigner's Wuhan Diary." Zhao Lijian did comment on that on Twitter and wrote, the real Wuhan Diary, hashtag, "Confidence Comes from Effectiveness," was translated from Arabic into English. Just that little description, that adjective, the real Wuhan Diary, says a lot in terms of the discrediting what Fang Fang's diary is. Without directly addressing it, he's basically taking part in this denunciation. And of course, there's this other darker world of alternative diaries that rise up, not the beautiful books with the QR codes, but these kind of diaries that appeared online by various trolls, like this one, Dispatches from USA, New York Diary, which is mocking the cover of HarperCollins with a Grim Reaper. This is, of course, a direct comment on the incredible number of deaths that the United States faced due to COVID-19. On the right is another diary. This one is called American Diary, and you can see there 298. That's because this is actually the 298th installment, and it didn't stop there. It went on well into the 300s, and which is also quite miraculous, because if you remember, Fang Fang's diary only went on for 60 days. This thing went on for more than a full calendar year and garnered millions of views. The author, Yambear6, has something like 6.5 million followers on Weibo. And so his diary it was basically a diary written in the style of Wuhan Diary, but highly satirical, mocking, and it would basically attack the United States and its handling of COVID-19. And Fang Fang and even myself, and this is, I put this here just for fun, this is one of the installments of the diary where I was the target. And so the title of this one was 白日你为什么不做美国的 Fang Fang? So Michael Berry, how come you don't be America's Fang Fang? Basically calling upon me to document America's failure to control COVID-19 during that first year or 2 years when there were so many indeed, there were so many terrible, terrible losses, terrible policies that were not enacted. Well, I shouldn't say terrible policies. There was no federal policy initially for COVID-19, and so that just shows you the underbelly. And finally, I want to close just with some of the takeaways from Fang Fang. And one thing that she does say throughout her diary was she emphasizes compliance with healthcare protocols and policies, face masks, quarantine regulations, social distancing. But there's also a common sense element to this. She's not, towards the end of the diary, she does start calling on the government to let us out and, you know, how you can't go on forever. And she does call on reasonable policies be enacted to help, for instance, those people with secondary illnesses that need treatment. And so there's a common, her approach to COVID-19 is very much fueled by governmental policies, but also medical policies, I would say even more so. For instance, she starts wearing a face mask before there's even the word for COVID-19, before there's any official cases. She just hears rumors about a SARS-like illness that's circulating, and this is in early January of 2020, and she starts voluntarily wearing a face mask. Compare that to, say, the United States and all the raging against face masks for so long. Issues of accountability. Again, she did not hesitate to call her own government to account for the failures. Take the United States, for example. We now have, I think, over 1 million deaths due to COVID-19. And if you look at Wuhan, there were roughly a half a dozen high-level officials who were punished, dismissed from office, stripped of their official titles for the mishandling of COVID-19. That is fact. That's on the record. Do you know of a single American government official who has expressed apology, who has resigned, who has assumed any form of responsibility for the incredible mishandling of COVID-19 during that first year in the United States? I know of none. But I think Fang Fang is a great model for us as we start to emerge into hopefully a post-COVID world or COVID-free world one day, to one day reflect and really hold those individuals who did create great harm for society in their mishandling of things to account. It says a lot about the civil society and the fragility of civil society. Fang Fang's case, it's quite clear. She's now basically silent. She can't publish. Her works can't be reprinted. She's often discouraged from even accepting interviews. And here in the United States, I'm drawing a few parallels to think about how we can learn from Fang Fang, but I think civil society is very much in great jeopardy here in the US as well. If you think about the political division, political extremism, disinformation, fake news. I mean, a lot, as I was in the tunnel of this experience, translating Fang Fang's diary and living through the daily death threats and hate campaign, I think one of the greatest takeaways was how similar it was to what was happening here in the United States, also in Brazil and in United Kingdom. Countries all around the world were facing a similar intersection between COVID-19 and the fragility of civil society, the rise of disinformation, the rise of internet hate. And I think there's a lot we can take away from how Fang Fang faced this down with such grace, dignity, and courage, even when the stakes were so very high. And I think for that, it takes courage, and it takes the importance for everyone to tell their own story, to document their truth. Fang Fang never wanted to be the be-all, end-all account of the Wuhan lockdown. She talks about how everyone needs to tell their story, and it's only by piecing together a myriad of complementary stories and alternative and differing stories that we finally begin to emerge some semblance of the truth begins to emerge. And I think that really speaks to the power of literature. I mean, in this day and age where not many people are reading novels or long books or full-length accounts and everyone's tweeting, this is a writer who rose up and used literature to bear witness and to shape the world around her and to truly impact change. And so that's where I'm going to close. And thank you all for your attention.
Michael, thank you so much for that terrific talk. I have so many questions for you. I do want to let everyone know that they can feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I will be sure to direct those questions to Professor Berry. But just to get us started off, I know that in a lot of our discussions about literature and translation, there is this effort by the translator to try to, in many ways, be as invisible as possible, or to make the translation process a way to have a kind of seamless movement between languages. And there are obviously different translation techniques and styles, but in a lot of ways, this is a goal and in a lot of contexts. Now, obviously, in the case of the Wuhan Diary, because of this new digital culture within which it was being written, within which it was being circulated, within which it was being trolled, we see a situation where it's not only could you not erase yourself from the process or attempt to mitigate your role in this translation process, but you became part of the story. I mean, we saw pictures of you on the diary in the US. So first of all, what does that feel like as a translator? How is that strange? What was that process of navigating it? And second, when we're thinking about the process of translation in a digital context, are there new kinds of theoretical constructs or new ways that we need to consider the role of the translator given the context of disinformation and political commentary online?
Yeah, thank you for that. No, it was quite surreal to be, translators often are fighting for credit. Often they don't even get their names on the cover of a book. Right? And I know the American Literary Translators Association has been fighting for a long time to make sure that all translators are properly credited with, their name on covers. And here is a case where not only was I kind of credited, but it was overemphasized in a way to the extent that in some of the troll accounts, I was actually the mastermind of this project or something, or the author, or the evil wizard behind the screen that was pulling the strings. And actually, what's quite ironic is that the trolls had begun to attack Fang Fang and the book almost as soon as she began writing in late January. It was they were ready to attack, but what really moved it from a bunch of chatter online to a nationwide disinformation campaign was, in fact, the act of translation. As soon as the Amazon pre-order pages for Wuhan Diary went up on Amazon UK, Amazon US, and Amazon Germany on April 7th or 8th, that's when this exploded. And what was it that they were able to use to leverage this escalation? It was precisely by taking a discourse that had been a local discourse within a Chinese cultural context, and now this kind of notion that it was being escalated into a global discourse, and that what Fang Fang had said was one thing in the Chinese context, but once it was known that those same words would be transmitted and circulated in a global context, that was unacceptable for a lot of readers. And so the actual act of translation became targeted. And I recall this in the book, there was actually a memo that was shared with me by a kind of former official writing to a group of government offices in China, recommending them to target the book using the translation, and that we need to, and that this book posed a great national security risk for China, and we need to mobilize our scholars and our various departments to get our hands on the translation, to comb through it meticulously, find any and all mistakes and use those mistakes to undermine the translation, call for it to be pulled from bookstores or to not be published, if possible, stop publication preemptively. And basically the call was to weaponize the translation in a sense, or to use this translation to bring down the book and to discredit the entire book. And so that was, yeah, again, something as a translator who's been doing literary translation for more than 2 decades, something that was just outside the box and completely unexpected in it. And I think it did also change my approach to translation in certain ways, because once I was conscious of that, I knew that this had to be airtight, that I couldn't, I had to be just as careful as possible not to amplify anything, not to leave anything out. At one point, HarperCollins actually thought of doing an abridged version of the book because it is somewhat repetitive, you know, because it's a daily account and sometimes she'll go over certain things. There's some content that might not be as interesting for certain global readers. And so they thought about kind of having a shorter abridged version. But once we realized that that would likely open up the door to even more attacks, because the editorial process, we just wanted to present as pure and accurate account of her words and let her speak for themselves. And so there was really, our translators often talk about this tightrope between loyalty to the original and readability in your target language. And in this case, I was a bit further on the side of loyalty to the original. I'm always very mindful of that, of course, but in this case, there were such stakes riding on what was happening that I had to be ultra sensitive, hypersensitive to that. And in terms of the second part of your question about the challenges of translating a digital text and what new questions that poses, you know, it's kind of a mission impossible, because the version of Wuhan, like here's a hard copy of it, right, which is, you know, 400 pages, and it's just Fang Fang's words that we have here. But if you were encountering the diary in its original format on Chinese social media, it was a completely different reading experience. You were reading her account. Of course, the language is different, right? But the biggest thing is that there's going to be a message board, right, of comments, a string of, and in her case, with so many readers, there would sometimes be tens of thousands of comments on a single post. And these comments were filled with, some of them were love letters, and some of them were vicious attacks, death threats, you know, terrible, heinous things they were saying. Some are post links to videos, to images, to memes, and it creates a very different, a fundamentally different reading experience when you're encountering this text online in a Chinese digital context than when you're encountering it months later in a paper or even a digital form in the US, because you're still just getting this. You're not getting all of that extra material. But I think that extra material had a fundamental role in shaping readers' reactions and perceptions of this diary. It was also, in the digital context, it was a cat and mouse game. You didn't just pick it up and read it, you had to find it. It was a kind of detective work, because the censors were actively trying to crush this book. And so she started posting on Weibo. Some of them would go out, some that'd be up for a period of time, and then they get pulled down. In the meantime, readers would cut and paste the content, turn them into PDFs, circulate them on other platforms, circulate them through email, circulate them on WeChat. At some point, Fang Fang found herself unable to continue circulating on Weibo, so she migrated to WeChat. And when that became unavailable to her, she started using, there was a user based in the United States named Arxiang, and she started using Arxiang to disseminate her work. So Arxiang became a major player in this kind of game of digital dissemination. And so some, you know, her read, she had these loyal readers who would stay up every night till midnight, till 1, 2 in the morning, waiting for her next post. Some would write to her and say, I can't sleep till I read your next post. I need to know you were okay. I need to know what's happening. But it wasn't just logging on. Somebody would have to find them. And like I said, there was this cat and mouse game in terms of dissemination. So all of that is inherently lost in translation. And I don't think we have a good theory in terms of how to articulate some of those differences. But in my afterword, I do talk a little bit about the different reading experiences of encountering Wuhan Diary in its original form versus English, but hopefully that gives you some sense of the different experience.
No, this is fascinating. And in addition to like the amazing and incredibly diligent work, I was reading some of your social media posts about preparing this, about writing Wuhan Diary and, being like translating for 12 hours in a row, which, which hurts my brain just reading about it, let alone actually doing it like repeatedly over the course of the time during the pandemic. So I just wanted to emphasize like what an amazing service this was to English language readers. But also this, the process of thinking through all of these questions of, what does it mean when we're translating from English to Chinese across different platforms in the context of censorship, in the context of different distribution modes. And then this actually makes me also think about my time as a PhD student when we would read the Zuozhuan, and there were the commentaries that were written on the side of the, and I remember finding it so difficult to understand like what the role of those commentaries were and what it was like to encounter the text with commentaries as a reader at that time. And I just wonder if we're now in a moment where we have these new forms of reading and commenting that might not be incredibly like understandable to people in 50 or 100 years. And so there's this, a new kind of mode of reading that we're in the midst of, that will likely be difficult to replicate as platforms evolve and we have different modes of communication and distribution. But we have some great questions in the chat, and I want to thank Emily Matson, who is a UVA PhD history graduate and who teaches at American University. So she wrote, "Professor Barry, thank you for a fascinating presentation. I have read your excellent translation of Yuhua's To Live, as well as your book on history of pain. How did translating Fang Fang's diary add to your pre-existing understanding of trauma in Chinese society, which has appeared in much of your research?" By the way, she says, "I utilized your history of pain a lot in writing my undergraduate thesis on historical memory of the Nanjing massacre in China. Thank you so much for your scholarship." Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Emily, for your question and your kind words and support. I'm going to be completely honest. So I've done a lot of books that are related to trauma. My dissertation, which later became a history of pain, and I've translated several novels that the backdrop, historical fiction, the backdrop of which are various incidents of historical trauma in modern China. And when I took this project on, honestly, I did not think about it through that rubric at all. I just, so a little bit about the context, to backtrack a little, I had been translating, I mentioned Soft Burial, this novel about the land reform campaign by Fang Fang. And I had been translating that novel. And so I knew Fang Fang, I had been working with her. I was in the middle of this project. And then the lockdown came, and I knew that she was in Wuhan, so we would text back and forth, and we were in touch, and I would check on her and her family, make sure she was okay. And I didn't even know, I hadn't been following her so much on Weibo. We were just on WeChat, sending the text messages. And I really didn't follow the first couple entries of her diary. And then it was a friend of mine, actually my former advisor, David Wong at Harvard. I was speaking to him on the telephone, and he said, "By the way, have you been reading Fang Fang's online diary about the lockdown?" And I said, "I just glanced at a few, but I didn't really read it in depth." He said, "You should really take a closer look at it." And I took a closer look, and I read only 2 or 3 entries. And it gave me such a different perspective than what I was getting. I mean, that was the moment where I think a lot of us were just starting to pay attention to COVID-19, and what we were getting from, whether it's CNN or Xinhua or whatever your preferred source of news is, tend to be very short, superficial, 500 word, 1,000 word accounts about, various on the ground reporting. But when I read Fang Fang's account, it had a certain humanism, and it had a depth, and it had a sensitivity that I just had not seen in any of the other accounts. And I immediately wrote to her and said, let's put Soft Burial aside, and why don't I translate your diary instead? I just think it's an important event that's unfolding right now in Wuhan, and I don't think it's relevant only to Wuhan or people in China, but I think this is a kind of global story. And but I didn't think about it as a trauma at that stage. I mean, this is pretty early into the lockdown. It was a global health crisis, but I really didn't think about it from that perspective as someone who had studied trauma. And eventually that would change, and I came to actually feel that it is a traumatic narrative on multiple levels, and the trauma that it explores isn't just the trauma of COVID-19 and the lockdown, but it's also I look at it almost as a tale of two viruses. On the one hand, the virus of the health crisis, COVID-19, and the other is the virus of disinformation, political extremism, of online hate. And those are the two viruses that they're intricately intertwined. I mean, one of the first books about COVID-19 that come out was Slavoj Zizek wrote a book on COVID, and he talked about this kind of interplay between disinformation and hate campaigns and COVID-19. And I think indeed he pinpoints something very early on that would take root not just in China, but in the US and all around the world, where somehow this health crisis triggered this rise in political extremism and so much hate, so much fracture. I mean, right now, I think the US is still very much a fractured country and very, very divided under these deep, deep political fissures. And in China, I think it's also a very divided country, although half of those voices are largely silent, because I think they know to articulate that their grievances or their, is politically risky. But I think all over the world we're facing this. And so I did look at it as a kind of eventually come to look at it as a traumatic narrative dealing with these two types of viruses, the health crisis and disinformation, political extremism.
So for those of you who are joining us, we are talking with Michael Berry, the author of the upcoming Translation, Disinformation, and Wuhan Diary, Anatomy of a Cyber Campaign, that is available for pre-order on Amazon. And he's also the translator of Wuhan Diary, which just is out in paperback last week. And so we have another question from Jing Wang. Thanks, Dr. Berry, for all your work. It is so important to have Fang Fang's work translated into English so more people get to remember what happened back in 2020. In Guo Binyang's work, The Wuhan Lockdown, he used many diaries, including Fang Fang's, to reconstruct that period during the early stage of COVID-19. Both of your works involve translation of diaries as well as analysis. I'm curious how you think of diary writing, not only for Fang Fang, but also for ordinary people during COVID. How can scholars outside China better use translation of these human stories for a wider public? Thanks.
Thank you for that question, Jing. It's kind of curious that during the early stage of the lockdown, the diary genre emerged as one of the most powerful conduits for people to express their thoughts, feelings, fears, anger, all the different emotions that people were going through. I think the lockdown itself inherently lent itself to this diary format because you're locked down at home, right? It's unlike, say, film or drama, where it's a collaborative art and you need multiple people. Can't do that. A novel is going to require, a long amount of time investment. And I think a lot of people in that moment, there was this sense of urgency to document what they were experiencing. And I just want to emphasize, Fang Fang may be probably the best known diarist during this period, but she was certainly not the only one. There were hundreds and hundreds of public diarists that were posting online, that were galvanizing people in different ways. There were different forms of diaries, or different forms of online posts. There were websites that were posting, that were kind of clearinghouse for emergency help during the height of the lockdown. One of them in particular, people were uploading their medical records, their x-rays of their lungs, and saying, this is my husband's x-ray. He's in this condition. He's in this part of the city. We can't get a hospital bed. Who can help us? And when you read they are heart-wrenching, and and unfortunately, in the wake of the political kind of purge of the narrative, so to speak. So many of those websites have been taken down. So many of those accounts have been erased. I mean, this is, again, one of the reasons I wrote my book was seeing the discourse just dismantled before my eyes. I just thought someone's got to preserve this. And I imagine Professor Yang, when he wrote his book, may have had a similar sentiment in terms of the way so much discourse was being erased. And it's so important that scholars and individuals document what had happened and kind of bear testament to this really incredible page in our contemporary history. And so I think these diaries, on the one hand, they sometimes served a highly personal place in helping individuals cope with what they were going through, just psychologically. But in other cases, like the case of Fang Fang, they also served a social function in terms of galvanizing people. But the diary has a very different place, I think, in modern China than it does probably in the West, or I mean, every country, right? The diary format's going to take on its unique cultural identity. And within China, you've had, I mean, there's classic fiction works written in the diary format. Think of Lu Xun's Diary of a Madman. Think of Ding Ling's Diary of Miss Sophie, right? Which have been kind of cornerstone works, not only in modern Chinese literature, but in the modern Chinese cultural imagination. We're fast forward several decades during the socialist period, Lei Feng's diary, right? This was probably the most read diary in Chinese history. And that was very much a sanitized, politically correct account, almost not only an account, but also a how-to manual of how you should conduct yourself. Just like Yang Banxi model operas, Lei Feng's diary, I think, was also instructive of how everyone should ideologically behave in society. And that also contributes, I think, to how something like Wuhan Diary was received. Because if you have large subset of the population that grew up during that period reading Lei Feng's diary, and this is what a diary is, Fang Fang does something very different with her diary. And I think maybe some of the tension was that people wanted the politically correct version, the sanitized version, the version that, you know, shouts slogans and phrases Xi Jinping, just like Lei Feng phrased Mao Zedong. And unfortunately for them, Fang Fang's diary did not serve that function. And it plays a very different role. Also, finally, just keep in mind, Fang Fang never called this a diary. That was a description that was put on the diary from others. And so it took on that name, it took on that identity, but this is not how Fang Fang necessarily self-identified her writing as a diary. This is kind of, the public took it and ran with it, and it became something. And this is, of course, in a macro sense, the entire project became like this. It took on a life very, very different and very unhinged from what it initially was intended to do and the social function it was intended to serve. And a lot of that has to do with the scapegoating, the politicization, and the way in which the troll culture rose up and transformed this diary into something very, very different.
Thank you, Professor Berry, for that helpful explication, and also for explaining to us that that this diary concept is something that came from the crowds, and that there's a lot about this dialogue that has really shaped the project. So we have a question from Joseph Seeley, who is an assistant professor of Korean history here at UVA. He says, "Thanks for the presentation. Have any of the counter diaries you cited in your presentation, those that more closely hew to the official line about the pandemic in Wuhan, been as commercially successful? Could you speak more, if possible, to popular reception of these counter diaries?" And before that, I want to be sure to note that Jing says, "Indeed, thanks for this historical overview of the diary writing tradition in China. I agree, social media and Fang Fang's approach is quite different from the previous diary format." But so comments from Jing and question from Joseph, and I will turn the floor over.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. So the other diaries have not been commercially successful in a global setting. Some of them have been influential in a kind of cultural, like for instance, Ai Xiaoming, who is a pretty radical intellectual documentarian, filmmaker, cultural studies figure. She wrote a diary as well, and excerpts of that circulated online quite early. I think even some of those excerpts appeared maybe even before the publication of Wuhan Diary. And those, I think, had some impact. Guo Jing's diary had a bit of an impact. Liu Yu's diary had a bit of an impact in Taiwan, where they were published. I don't think either of those were published in Western languages. There was I forgot the author's name, but he experienced the lockdown in Wuhan, and then he traveled to Europe and was under lockdown in France. And he wrote a book in French comparing the Wuhan lockdown with the lockdown he experienced in Europe. And so all of those enjoyed some readership, but nothing, I don't think, these are not works that were translated into multiple languages and had the same kind of cultural impact. Fang Fang's is the one that really just kind of cut through, and it, although it critically acclaimed in all of these different markets and regions, it was commercially successful in some regions much more so than others. So Germany, it was a top 10 bestseller for months. It did very well in the German market. And actually the publisher then went ahead and published several of Fang Fang's other novels as follow-ups, and all of them have been very well received. In other markets like America, I don't think the sales of the diary were, I don't have numbers, but they were not probably what, the publisher or others may have hoped. And so there's a great disparity in terms of how it was received in terms of commercial sales. I think a lot of people maybe read the media accounts and felt like that was all they needed. They didn't want to go the extra depth to actually read the book. But I mean, if you really want to see what all the fuss is about and and really get the unadulterated vision that this writer put forth, I think you need to go to her words, which I think are so important for us to remember as we navigate these kind of perilous waters, not just with COVID-19, but also with disinformation. I mean, one of the things that's miraculous about the book is that as it progresses, it becomes less about COVID-19 and more about disinformation. The last third of the book is mostly about internet troll culture, and that kind of rises up as one of the major themes of the book. And so that transformation is also quite miraculous to see, as how the real virus kind of shows its face, so to speak. As for the government produced alternative accounts that rose up, actually some of them have appeared in English, and those are government subsidized, and you can find them on Amazon, and most of them are only available in Chinese. And they are the kind of books that are by usually major publishing houses, and you go to a bookstore and they'll be all set up in the front in a big display, and there's a lot of subsidy behind them to kind of make them visible, to make them required readings. But I don't know how many, it's hard to determine how much of their popularity is kind of bottom-up grassroots and how much is top-down, these subsidies and promotions, and the way in which the marketing structure in China has given emphasis to these books in order to emphasize, just like I'll give you, just before the lockdown in November of 2019, I went to a bookstore in a Buddhist temple in China, in Xiamen, and I was kind of shocked to see the collected works of Xi Jinping on display at the front of the bookstore. This is clearly not necessarily a market-driven decision, but a political decision. And I suspect that the production and circulation of many of these official diaries is very much like that. That is, they're government subsidized, and they're meant to really drown out other non-official diaries by inundating the market with these types of accounts, so that that's all you really have access to, and that becomes by default the truth that everyone prescribes. That's not to say they're not inauthentic. I'm sure many of these are real accounts by frontline workers, and they're genuine, but they are also very much curated to not highlight criticisms, to not highlight things like the silencing of Li Wenliang, or to not highlight those early statements that COVID-19 is not transmissible between humans and you don't have to worry about that. Of course, later they backtracked about that. But there were these kind of missteps that are really not dealt with in a forthright manner in those official accounts, as they are dealt with by Fang Fang and Herd.
Thank you so much, Professor Barry. This has been a really, really remarkable talk. I've learned a great deal. It's been exciting to hear behind the curtain about the experience of translating, about the experience of being caught amidst all of these, online cyber campaigns, and to hear about your exciting new book, Translation, Disinformation, and Wuhan Diary, The Anatomy of a Transpacific Cyber Campaign, which I am really excited. I've already pre-ordered it and I can't wait to read it when it comes out. And we just want to thank you so much for coming to our virtual campus and for being part of being our first speaker in the speaker series this semester. And we hope to see you, we all hope to see you soon, maybe at an Asian Studies conference or maybe in California. But in any case, best of luck and thank you again for being part of our community for today.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you to all our participants and those who asked questions. It was nice to share this virtual space with you, and stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And just as a reminder, we have a really exciting calendar of events coming up this semester. Next week, we have Mike Lampton coming to speak in our Belt and Road Initiative, talk series, who's a really great speaker and a well-known China expert. So I urge all of you to come take a look. And let's give Professor Barry one more. I see lots of thanks and appreciation in the chat, and we hope to connect with you again soon. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.